Hi, we have an assessment challenge coming up, and I wanted to give you some guided examples for how you might approach that project. So, the paper is going to be on the fundamentals of assessment. It's worth 20% of your grade, and your task is to demonstrate that you understand assessment, the concepts, and the vocabulary. So you'll prepare an APA-style paper, 4 to 6 pages, double-spaced, the old 12-point Times Roman typeface, and you'll use APA citations and references, and I'll show you some examples shortly. You'll choose an authentic situation, something that is really happening or could really happen. So, for example, I'm going to choose the topic, how do we measure student success in the Allentown School District's new high school, Building 21? And remember, this may be part one of a course-long theme. You may choose to do all of your major projects on this theme. So, you're going to focus on core concepts and you'll explain them in plain English so you and I know that you understand it. And there's a kind of a funny saying that helps make this clear. When the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. He wants to see, how is it? Does it need more salt? Does it need more vegetables? Is it too garlicky? Whatever. So he's tasting it in order to change it. Then when the guests taste the soup, that's summative assessment. It's too late to make changes, and that's the final grade for the soup. So my title of the paper would be Assessing Student Progress at Building 21. And first I need to think, well, what do I want to measure, or what do I need to measure? And I, in this case, would pick three things. I'd want to measure the student academic progress in ELA, that's English Language Arts, and in math. Those are the two subjects that get the high-stakes tests. I'd also want to measure student success in project-based learning because the school is built around project-based learning. And I'd want to measure student attendance because that's a measure of how interested or motivated students are in school. So for each of those, I'd want to identify a formative and a summative measure. So for formative measures, a gradebook, monthly check, quarterly report card grades, and other benchmarks of criterion-based assessments in specific ELA and math tasks, so I can see by month and by quarter how are students doing. That's enough time to go back and help them, hopefully. If I was a classroom teacher, I would do formative assessment much more frequently, daily or weekly. But as an outsider, I'm thinking monthly, quarterly. Similarly, I'd get their grades for project-based, for their learning projects, and their monthly and quarterly attendance. For summative measures, I'd get their final grades, their final attendance, and their high-stakes test scores. So here's what the actual writing might look like to show your vocabulary understanding. So I might title this part of my paper, Formative and Summative Traditional Assessment, and to show what words I am using specifically to show that I understand them, I've put them in color. You may put them in boldface, italicize them, underline them, just make sure it's clear. So to assess student progress in Building 21, we'll use 11th graders because they take the high-stakes PSSA standardized tests. While this will be a summative assessment, we need formative assessments to identify how well each student is learning and where they may need help, and that's as the school year goes on, not the end. We will use last year's standardized test as a rough baseline. That's kind of a diagnostic assessment, so we know where to place students, kids who we know need extra help in math or English. We can place in classes that will give them that. So project-based learning is something we need to assess, so I might have a separate section titled assessment of project-based learning. And so I'd say something like to assess students in team-based projects, we'll use a more authentic assessment, and I should be able to, yeah. So I might underline that. Authentic assessment instrument, then quizzes and tests, and then in contrast to the objective criterion-based assessments that are used for academic progress, the project-based learning assessment will be a norm-referenced assessment. So that means that we will evaluate kids in sort of rank order, like, these kids know it best and those kids know it least, as opposed to like a percent that it would compare kids to all kids around the country. And notice that I have also, let's see, where is it? This little part that shows where I got this information. So Waters and McCracken wrote a paper in 1997 on norm referenced assessments in project-based learning. So that's where I got this information, and this is how I cite it. So wherever I put the content that comes from an outside source, I just put parentheses, the author's last names, and the publication date. No big deal. Then this authentic assessment of a PBL will be more subjective because it's based on teacher observation and judgment. So that's an idea of how to use some of that vocabulary. Now, we know that all testing has error and bias, and in this case, since there's some teacher evaluated stuff, some project-based learning, I would want the sources of error and bias maybe in a separate part. So we know that PSSA and textbook tests are relatively reliable and valid across students means sort of on the average. But for individual students, we need to be sensitive to the normal error induced by differing student moods. So maybe a kid didn't sleep the night before a big test, or maybe he broke up with his girlfriend or had an auto accident, and that will affect the test. So one test for one kid is not particularly reliable. And then we should also be sensitive to the bias that against LEP, that's limited English proficiency, and special education students. And I got that information from Dochi et al. Et al. Just means and his co-authors. So there were like 4 authors. Rather than write them all out, I just do Dochi et al. And then the publication date. The PBL assessment will have more error because its reliability and validity are undefined. And with more space, I'd explain that because the teacher is creating that. Teacher subjectivity is also an expected source of error due to observation error and bias. So when I'm done, I have at the end a list of references. So you may do, if you do a 6-page paper, the references may make it 7 or whatever. So the references aren't included in the 4 to 6 pages. And this is just kind of standard APA. You start with the authors, last names, their first initials, the publication date. The list is by alphabetical author last name, got it from the web, there's a way to show that. Uh, I'd also add one or two questions that I would use to assess skills. So that just shows, okay, these are the questions I would use, and so I know what I'm talking about. So if you're new to APA, one of the best places to get some help on this is the Purdue University Online Writing Lab, OWL, and that's just owl.english. .purdue.edu. Very, very simple. Okay, so that should give you enough guidance, and I look forward to reading your work. Thanks.